At an air show, 85-year-old Harold Benton, a Vietnam War F-4 Phantom pilot, stands unnoticed, clutching a paper flag. Haunted by memories of lost comrades, he's a silent hero until an F-22 pilot, Lieutenant David Lawson, breaks protocol with a deliberate wingdip salute, honoring Harold's unspoken sacrifice. A young man, Jason, reveals Harold saved his grandfather's life in 1971. The crowd, initially oblivious, begins to recognize the quiet veteran's valor. As whispers spread, a viral video of the moment sparks global tributes. But what secrets does Harold still carry? And why does he return every year? If Harold's story touched you, honor the silent heroes in your life. Share their stories in the comments. Like and subscribe to our channel. Your support keeps these tales alive. Join us to celebrate courage. Hit that bell for more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching and caring. The F-22 tore through the heavens, its twin engines unleashing a primal roar that vibrated through the chests of the crowd below. The air show at Randolph Air Force Base was alive with excitement. Families sprawled on blankets, kids pointing skyward, camera phones flashing to capture the jet's sleek silhouette against the Texas sun. But at the edge of the spectacle, near a sagging chain-link fence, an old man stood apart, unnoticed. His gnarled hand clutched a small paper flag, its edges frayed from years of careful folding. A faded Phantom Squadron cap rested low over one brow, casting a shadow across his weathered face. To the throng of spectators, he was invisible, just another gray-haired figure blending into the background of lawn chairs and chatter. But when the jet carved a sharp turn, its left wing dipping low in a deliberate arc, something shifted. In that fleeting moment, Harold Benton's heart stuttered. Through the tinted visor of the cockpit, he glimpsed the young pilot's eyes, steady, searching, fixed on him. The crowd's cheers swelled, some puzzled, others hushed, but only Harold understood the weight of that gesture. The sky itself had just paid homage. At 85, Harold Benton carried his years with a quiet dignity. He wasn't a tall man, but his posture was unyielding. His shoulders squared as if defying time itself. His steps were measured, never rushed, and he waved off offers of help with a polite but firm nod. His jaw, set like carved stone, hinted at a resolve that hadn't softened since 1971, when he piloted an F-4 Phantom through the dense, hostile skies of Vietnam. Harold never spoke of valor or glory. He didn't speak of the war at all. To him, labels like hero were for others to toss around. He was just a man who did his job and came home. But home was no hero's welcome. There were no parades, no crowds waving flags. Instead, Harold returned to a quieter battlefield. Silence. The world had moved on, and he buried his medals in an old footlocker, their gleam dulled by dust. He settled in a modest one-story house on the outskirts of Coralville, Texas, where rolling pastures stretched under a wide, unyielding sky. The hum of shortwave radios became his solace, their static a language he understood better than small talk. Harold had a gift for coaxing life from broken things. Radios, mostly, the kind others deemed beyond repair. His fingers, calloused but precise, could tune a dead frequency until it sang again. But words? Those were harder. The war was a locked vault, its key lost long ago, even to his wife Martha. Martha had tried once to breach that silence. Early in their marriage, her eyes had lingered on a framed photo by his nightstand, a younger Harold, his crooked smile half hidden under a helmet, the jungle heat etched into his face. She'd asked softly who that man was, what he'd seen. Harold's gaze had drifted to the floor, and he'd offered nothing but a shake of his head. Martha never pressed again. She learned to love the man he was now, not the shadow he carried. When cancer stole her a decade ago, Harold stood dry-eyed at her funeral, his grief too deep for tears. He folded her hospice blanket with care, laying it on the couch as if she might reclaim it one day. He hadn't touched it since. Their son, Doug, followed his father's and into the Air Force, though his battles were fought in offices, not cockpits. He lived states away, their conversations confined to brief calls on birthdays or Christmas. Harold didn't resent the distance. The world had shifted, and he no longer knew how to bridge it. His truest companion was Daisy, a graying border collie whose slow gait mirrored his own. She'd settle by the front door each night, her eyes alert, as if guarding something sacred. Perhaps she was. Every year, without fail, Harold made the same pilgrimage. 2 hours east, east, through twisting country roads and bustling highways, he drove to Randolph Air Force Base for the air show. He claimed the same spot by the fence, far from the crowds, and stood beneath the thunder of engines. It wasn't about nostalgia or recognition. It was about feeling something raw, something the spectators, with their selfies and sodas, could never grasp. He didn't wear his old uniform or carry faded photos, just his Phantom Squadron cap and that small paper flag tucked into his jacket pocket. The flag wasn't for display. It was for the ghosts, for the brothers who never came home, for the salutes they never received. Harold always went alone. That solitude was his sanctuary, the one place where the part of him no one understood could breathe. Until this year, the sky had other intentions. Harold's mornings were a ritual carved in stone. For 30 years before the first light crept over the horizon, he was awake, seated at his kitchen table under the faint buzz of a fluorescent bulb. The house around him held a stillness that seemed to listen. Daisy would rouse herself from her blanket in the corner, her joints creaking as she padded over to settle at his feet, her warm presence a quiet comfort. Harold shunned modern conveniences like coffee makers. They felt too sterile, too detached. Instead, he heated water in a battered metal kettle, its dents a map of decades. As the steam rose, he'd stare out the window, his thoughts drifting to places he'd never name aloud. The kettle's whistle would pull him back, grounding him in the rhythm of routine. This was Harold's world, steady, solitary, and unspoken. But on air show day, something stirred in him. A flicker of anticipation, a tightening in his chest. He'd adjust his cap, check the flag in his pocket, and set out. Daisy watching from the porch as if she knew he'd return with a weight lifted, if only for a moment. That morning, as the F-22's wing dipped low, Harold felt time collapse. The pilot's gaze wasn't just a glance, it was a recognition, a silent acknowledgement across generations. Harold's throat tightened, his grip on the flag growing fierce. He didn't know the pilot's name, didn't need to. In that moment, they were bound by something deeper than words, a shared understanding of duty, of sacrifice, of skies that never forgot. The crowd's noise faded, and for the first time in years, Harold felt seen. Not as an old man by a fence, but as the pilot he'd been, the man who'd carried his brother's memory all these years. As the jet climbed back into the clouds, Harold stood taller, his eyes glistening but unyielding. The sky had saluted him, and he saluted back, his paper flag held high, trembling in the wind. Harold Benton rose before the sun, as he always did, his body tuned to a rhythm forged in the crucible of war. In the dim kitchen of his modest home, he brewed his coffee with deliberate care, pouring hot water through a cloth filter, a method he'd picked up in Vietnam. Back then, a steaming cup was the only solace after a mission, a fleeting moment of warmth amidst the chaos. The mug he cradled now was navy blue, its handle chipped from years of use, the Air Force insignia faded to a ghostly outline beneath the glaze. Imperfect as it was, Harold held it with a reverence reserved for sacred things, its weight in his hands anchoring him to the present, while memories flickered like shadows in his mind. After the coffee came the newspaper, always yesterday's edition, plucked from the corner store a day late. It was a quirk he couldn't quite explain, even to himself. Perhaps it was his way of holding time at bay, keeping the world's relentless march at arm's length. He'd unfold the paper on the kitchen table, scanning headlines with a detached gaze. Politics, crime, scandals, they blurred into a cacophony of noise, irrelevant to the quiet life he'd carved out. But when an obituary caught his eye, especially one mentioning a veteran, Harold would pause. His fingers would trace the words, his lips moving slightly as he read each line, as if committing the stranger's story to memory. In those moments, he felt a kinship, a silent nod to a shared burden, a quiet act of respect for those who'd carried the same weight he did. Once the coffee was gone and the paper folded, Harold reached for his squadron cap. It was no ordinary hat. The faded fabric had endured jungle monsoons and desert suns, soaked in sweat and stashed in a footlocker for decades. A tear in the seam had been mended with dental floss, a makeshift repair from a time when resourcefulness was survival. To Harold, it was more than cloth and thread. It was a tapestry of duty, loss, and resilience, each stitch a reminder of the men he'd flown with, the ones who'd made it home, and the ones who hadn't. He placed it on his head with a gentle precision, as if donning a crown of memories. With his cap in place and a fresh cup of coffee in hand, Harold stepped onto the back porch, the cool morning air brushing against his weathered face. Beyond his property stretched an open field, its tall grass swaying in the breeze. On certain mornings and when the wind moved just right, he could almost hear the hum of propellers slicing through the sky, the crackle of a headset, and the voice of his old wingman, Hawkeye Jim. Jim wasn't his real name, James Lockhart from Nebraska, but no one ever called him that. Jim had eyes sharper than any radar, spotting threats before they could take shape, saving their squadron countless times. Harold could still see him, lean and focused, his grin flashing like sunlight on water. But one mission had changed everything. Ambushed in a sky lit by tracer rounds, Jim's plane had taken the worst of it. His final radio call wasn't frantic or desperate, but calm, resolute. "Go, Hal, I'll keep 'em busy." And he had, buying Harold and the others time to escape. The mission was deemed a success, but the cost was a wound no debriefing could heal. Jim never got a hero's flag or a ceremonial flyover, just a name etched on a wall, lost to silence. Every morning as Harold stood on his porch, he'd lift his cap skyward for a fleeting moment, a private salute to the man who still watched over him in his heart. By 7:15, Harold was behind the wheel of his '98 Ford Ranger, its rust-flecked body rumbling softly as he merged onto the interstate. The 2-hour drive to Randolph Air Force Base was a familiar pilgrimage, every curve of the road etched into his memory. The radio murmured low, an AM station flickering between a Hank Williams ballad and a staticky weather report. Beside him, Daisy, his loyal dog, rested her head on his folded coat in the passenger seat. She wouldn't join him on the base, but her presence on the drive was a quiet comfort, her steady breathing a reminder of the simple joys that kept him grounded. As they approached San Antonio, the traffic thickened. SUVs sporting flag decals, minivans with children's faces pressed against windows. A convoy of carefree travelers heading to the air show for jet engines and sugary treats. They came for the spectacle, not the history, unaware of the sacrifices that kept the skies free. Harold didn't begrudge them their excitement. He hadn't come for the crowds or the maisimo. He came to remember. He pulled into Lot C, parking in the same spot he chose every year, shaded by an ancient mesquite tree. It was a longer walk than most would tolerate, but Harold didn't mind. As he stepped out, his knees protested with a familiar ache, a reminder of years spent in cockpits and on battlefields. He grabbed his folding stool, a small American flag, and adjusted his squadron cap, tucking it firmly into place. By 8:30, he'd reached his usual spot along the far western fence line, a place he called Section 12, though no sign marked it as such. It was his claim, a quiet corner near the last auxiliary pole, angled just right to catch the thunder of planes roaring down the runway. Here he could feel the past and present collide, the vibration of engines stirring memories of missions long gone. But this year something was different. His spot was already taken. A large family had claimed the entire area, their setup sprawling like a small village. Blankets and lawn chairs dotted the grass, collapsible tables groaned under piles of snacks and juice boxes, and coolers stood like sentinels on either side. Children darted about, waving foam jet toys, their laughter sharp and carefree. One teenager was live streaming, his phone perched on a selfie stick, narrating the scene with exaggerated enthusiasm. Harold stood still, his stool dangling from one hand, his flag tucked under his arm. The sight stirred a pang of dislocation, as if the world had shifted beneath him. This was his place, where he honored Jim, where he reconnected with the fragments of himself left behind in the sky. Yet, as he watched the family, their joy so unburdened, he felt a flicker of something softer, perhaps a reminder that life moved on, even when memories held him fast. Still, the weight of Jim's absence pressed heavier in that moment, and Harold wondered if there was room left in this changing world for the quiet rituals of an old airman. Harold Benton stood at the edge of the air show, the clamor of the crowd swirling around him like a restless tide. The sun beat down mercilessly, glinting off the polished fuselages of jets lined up along the tarmac. Families milled about, their voices a chaotic blend of laughter and shouts, punctuated by the occasional whine of an engine spooling up in the distance. A young mother nearby adjusted her ring light, framing her children, waving tiny American flags with practiced precision. To her, this was content, a moment to capture and post, not a solemn nod to history. Harold watched her for a moment, his weathered hands tightening around the splintered stick he'd picked up from the ground. Not out of sentiment, but simply to have something to hold. He felt out of place, a relic in a world that seemed to have forgotten the weight of the past. He took a cautious step forward, seeking a sliver of shade near the chain-link fence that separated the spectators from the runway. His old knees protested, but he ignored them, his eyes scanning the horizon for the familiar silhouette of planes he once knew better than his own reflection. That's when it happened. A sudden jolt, sharp and unyielding, as a teenage boy, no older than 15, barreled into him. The kid was chasing his younger brother, a wild blur of motion, his sneakers kicking up dust. The impact sent a shock through Harold's side, nearly toppling him. His arm throbbed where the boy's elbow had struck, but he caught himself, gripping the fence post to steady his balance. "Watch it, Grandpa," the teen muttered, his eyes never leaving the glowing screen in his hands. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were careless, tossed out without a glance. Harold's lips parted, a reflex to respond, but he swallowed the urge. What was there to say? The boy was already gone, weaving through the crowd, oblivious to the old man he'd nearly knocked over. Harold adjusted the brim of his faded Phantom cap, the one he'd worn to every air show for decades, and turned his gaze skyward. The vast, empty blue stretched out before him, indifferent to the noise below. Around him, cameras clicked incessantly, children shrieked, and flags, cheap plastic ones handed out at the gate, flapped in the breeze. Less a symbol of reverence than a prop for the day's spectacle. He took a few slow steps back, giving the family their space, his boots scuffing against the dry earth. His eyes searched for a quieter spot, somewhere he could still see the runway without being swallowed by the crowd. He found it, a small patch of grass, barely big enough for him to settle his canvas stool. From there, the jets were just specks, their sleek forms glinting faintly in the distance. No one around him knew the truth. That decades ago, Harold had flown faster than any of those planes, his hands steady on the controls of an F-4 Phantom, the roar of its engines drowning out the fear in his heart. To the people here, he was just an old man, unremarkable, trying not to get in the way. As he eased himself onto the stool, the weight of his years settled with him. His mind wandered unbidden to memories of missions long past, nights lit by tracer fire, the crackle of the radio, the split-second decisions that meant life or death. He pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on the distant hum of the air show. That's when he noticed someone approaching. Not a child chasing a sibling, not a parent wrestling with a stroller, but a young man, mid-20s, his stride deliberate yet hesitant. He wore jeans and a vintage bomber jacket, the kind that carried the weight of history, not something bought off a rack but inherited, its leather worn soft by time. In his hands he clutched a creased photograph, its edges frayed from years of handling. His eyes flicked between the photo and Harold, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Excuse me, sir," the young man said, his voice soft but steady, cutting through the din of the crowd. "Is that a Phantom cap?" Harold looked up, startled. Most people at these events wouldn't know an F-4 Phantom from a paper kite, let alone recognize the faded insignia on his cap. "It is," he replied, his voice gruff but warm, as he adjusted the brim with a practiced motion. The young man's face lit up, a mix of awe and disbelief flickering in his eyes. He took a cautious step closer, holding out the photograph as if it were fragile, a relic that might crumble under too much scrutiny. "My grandfather was in Vietnam," the young man said, his words careful, deliberate. "Ground crew. Carl Dawson. He passed a few years back, but before he did, he told me a story, a pilot who saved his life. It was at Tan Son Nhut, 71, during a rocket attack. He said he was pinned down, thought he was done for. But a Phantom pilot turned around, came in low and pulled a dive, so reckless it scattered the enemy just long enough for the medics to drag him to safety. Harold's brow furrowed, the way it always did when the past reached out to pull him back. The name sparked something deep in his memory, a fragment of a life he'd tried to leave behind. Carl Dawson, he murmured, almost to himself. Red toolbox, like Johnny Cash. The young man's eyes widened, his breath catching. That's him, he said, his voice trembling with recognition. That's exactly how he described himself. He talked about you for years, said he never got your name, just remembered your voice on the radio, calm as anything, and the way your plane looked. Silver nose, black tail stripes. Harold's hand shook slightly as he reached for the photograph, his fingers brushing the worn edges. It was grainy, black and white, the image warped by dust and heat. A group of young men stood beside an F-4 Phantom, their faces etched with the exhaustion and defiance of war. Near the center was a younger Harold, helmet tucked under his arm, a faint smirk playing on his lips, unaware that this moment would live on in someone else's story. His chest tightened, a mix of pride and pain he hadn't felt in years. I've been looking for you for almost 2 years, the young man said, his voice thick with emotion. Every forum, every vet registry, even old base logs. I thought it was a long shot. But last week I posted in a Vietnam-era aviation group online. A retired mechanic from Shepherd Air Base messaged me. He said, "You're looking for Harold Benton. He still goes to Randolph every spring. Find the guy in the Phantom cap." Harold's throat tightened, words eluding him. He looked at the photo again, then at the young man standing before him. There was a resemblance. Something in the jawline, the earnestness in his eyes, an echo of Carl Dawson's quiet determination. "My name's Jason," the young man added, his voice softer now. He glanced toward the sky and a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And I'm not here alone. My cousin's flying today, F-22 demo team, Lieutenant David Lawson. He knows about you too. He read the after-action reports, pieced together what you did for my grandfather." Harold blinked, the weight of the moment settling over him like a heavy coat. He'd never thought of his actions as anything more than duty, a job done in the chaos of war. To know that someone had carried that story, that it had shaped a family, left him speechless. "Sir," Jason said quietly, his voice steady but filled with reverence, "he's not just flying a routine today. He's flying for someone." In the distance, the speakers crackled to life, their tinny voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer began, the words fading into the hum of anticipation. Harold's gaze lifted to the sky, where a single F-22 traced a graceful arc, its engines roaring with a power that echoed the past. For the first time that day, he didn't feel like just another old man. He felt seen. The Texas sun beat down relentlessly, its heat pressing against Harold Benton's weathered skin, but it wasn't the warmth that made his hands tremble. In his grip, he clutched a faded photograph, its edges worn from years of handling, the faces of young men frozen in time staring back at him. Men he hadn't seen in over 50 years, their smiles etched with the reckless hope of youth, a hope that had long since faded for Harold. The roar of the crowd around him erupting in cheers as the announcer's voice boomed about the United States Air Force F-22 Raptor demonstration felt distant, like a memory from another life. Children shrieked with excitement, their small hands pointing skyward, while phones were raised, lenses zooming in to capture the spectacle. But for Harold, the world had narrowed to the weight of that photograph and the ache it stirred deep in his chest. Beside him stood Jason, his young friend, whose eyes were fixed on the horizon, searching for the first sign of the jet. "He's flying for you," Jason said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a vow. "David's read everything he could about your unit, especially the mission at Tanzan Nut. He says what you did saved dozens, but no one ever wrote you up for it." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, but Harold couldn't bring himself to respond. His throat tightened, his mind drifting back to that day in 1971, the jungle below a blur of green and fire, the deafening scream of his plane's engines as he defied orders to save a pinned-down crew. No medals, no recognition, just the quiet knowledge that he'd done what was right. Now, standing in this field, surrounded by strangers cheering for a show, he felt the weight of those unspoken years pressing down harder than the sun ever could. Then he saw it, a glint, sharp and fleeting, slicing through the endless blue of the sky. The crowd's cheers swelled, but Harold's breath caught as the unmistakable scream of twin engines tore through the air. The F-22 Raptor emerged from behind the stands, a sleek predator of steel and fire, cutting through the atmosphere with the precision of a blade forged in thunder. It climbed steeply, impossibly fast, its ascent a defiance of gravity itself. Then, just as quickly, it leveled off, streaking across the field in a high-speed pass that sent a shockwave through the crowd. To most, it was just a maneuver, a dazzling display of power and skill. But to Harold, who had once piloted a jet at Mach 2 through a hellscape of flak and flame, it was something more. It was a language once spoken in the arc of a wing, the roar of an engine, the unspoken bond of those who had faced the sky and lived. And something about the jet's approach, its deliberate grace, its controlled fury, felt deeply, achingly personal. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant David Lawson's hands gripped the controls, his knuckles whitening with the intensity of his focus. The heads-up display glowed with a stream of data, speed, trajectory, coordinates, but his mind was elsewhere. It was fixed on a small patch of grass at the west end of the viewing area, Section 12, where Jason had told him Harold would be standing. For 2 months, David had immersed himself in Harold's story, piecing together fragments of a forgotten hero's life. He'd pored over flight logs, cross-referenced survivor accounts, and read between the lines of dry military reports. When he learned that Harold Benton was still alive, still coming to this air show year after year, something stirred within him, a mix of reverence and resolve. This wasn't just another demonstration flight. This was a chance to honor a man who had never been honored, to speak in the language of the sky that only pilots could understand. David's heart pounded as he weighed his decision. The flight sequence had been rehearsed countless times, every maneuver meticulously planned, approved by the demo team, signed off by the brass, and filed with the FAA. Deviating from the script could cost him suspension, grounding, maybe even his career. But Harold Benton hadn't followed orders when he banked his plane into enemy fire to save lives. That choice, made in the heat of battle, had defined him. Why, David thought, should I play it safe now? His voice was steady as he spoke into the comms. Control, this is Falcon 1, beginning second pass. The response came quickly. Roger, Falcon 1, maintain standard demo pattern. But David's hands were already moving, guiding the F-22 into a wide, controlled arc that curved deliberately toward the western fence line. On the ground, Jason's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. He's coming this way, he said, his voice trembling with excitement, his heart racing as he grabbed Harold's arm. Harold squinted against the sun, his old eyes straining to track the jet as it dropped lower, its approach tight and intentional. The roar grew deafening, the sound vibrating through the metal fence under Harold's hand, through the very ground beneath his feet. And then, at the precise moment the F-22 passed directly overhead, the left wing dipped. It wasn't a casual flick or a course correction. It was a full, deep, deliberate salute. The nose tilted slightly downward, the wing held low for exactly 3 seconds, a gesture as clear and profound as any spoken word. The crowd gasped, awestruck, unaware of the significance, but Harold understood. His hand tightened around the small flag he held, its fabric whipping violently in the jet's wake. His knees buckled, not from the frailty of age, but from the weight of something far deeper. A recognition, a reverence, a moment that reached across decades to touch the core of who he was. For the first time in his life, someone had saluted him. Not the uniform he'd once worn, not the abstract idea of service, but him, Harold Benton, the man who had flown into hell and come back without fanfare, without glory. The gesture was a message, written not in words but in the language of flight, carved across the sky for him alone. The F-22 soared upward, its engines trailing fire as it disappeared into the blue, leaving the world below to catch its breath. Jason stood silent, his own eyes glistening, knowing words would only diminish the moment. Harold wiped at his face, his fingers brushing away the sting of tears as he looked down at the trembling flag in his hand. He saw me, he whispered, his voice barely audible, cracking under the weight of realization. For a moment, the world fell still. The crowd, which had been a roaring sea of noise moments before, stood frozen, phones lowered, conversations halted mid-sentence. It was a silence born not of emptiness, but of something profound, a shared reverence, a collective understanding that something sacred had just unfolded in the sky above. The crowd turned one by one toward the far end of the fence line, their faces a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Something extraordinary had just unfolded, something that reached beyond the spectacle of an air show. The F-22's sharp dip of its wing wasn't just a stunt, it was a deliberate salute, heavy with meaning. Every pair of eyes now traced the jet's path backward, searching for its target. A teenage boy stood among them, the same one who had carelessly bumped into Harold earlier, muttering a dismissive, "Watch it." Now his bravado had evaporated, replaced by a quiet unease. His phone dangled in his hand, its screen glowing with a half-recorded video of the jet's pass, but he wasn't filming anymore. His gaze was fixed on the old man standing motionless, a small paper flag trembling in his grip. Harold's faded phantom cap cast a shadow over his weathered face, and his stillness radiated a quiet dignity. The boy's chest tightened with a mix of guilt and wonder, his earlier arrogance now a distant memory. Nearby, Harold's grandson stood slack-jawed, his phone forgotten in his hand. The screen showed a blurry, incomplete video, but he wasn't thinking about it. His eyes were locked on his grandfather, a man he'd always known as reserved, now the focal point of a silent reverence. Pride swelled in his chest, but it was tinged with regret for the stories he'd never asked about, the burdens his grandfather had carried in silence. A Vietnam veteran in a denim vest stood a few steps away, his weathered hands slowly removing his cap. He pressed it to his chest, his eyes glistening with unspoken understanding. He didn't need to ask questions. The jet's salute stirred memories of jungles, gunfire, and the roar of phantom engines. He stood taller, honoring a man he'd never met but felt connected to through shared sacrifice. A young mother, who had been live-streaming the event, lowered her phone with trembling hands. Her 7-year-old daughter tugged at her sleeve, asking, "Mom, who's that man?" The mother knelt, pulling her daughter close, and whispered, "Someone we owe everything to." Her voice caught, her heart swelling with gratitude she hadn't known she could feel. The little girl, sensing the moment's weight, waved shyly at Harold, her gesture pure and heartfelt. Then Jason stepped forward, his voice steady but resonant. "He flew with my grandfather," he said, "waved his life in Vietnam. That's who the jet saluted." His words rippled through the crowd, softening faces and quieting murmurs. A father, who had earlier taken Harold's usual spot, now stood with his arms around his children, his earlier irritation replaced by humility. The juice boxes, folding chairs, and social media posts faded away. This wasn't just an air show anymore. It was a moment of living history. The teenage boy, wrestling with his earlier dismissiveness, stepped forward. His throat tightened as he met Harold's gaze for the first time. "Sir," he said, his voice breaking, "I didn't know." Harold nodded gently, his expression kind but guarded. The boy raised a trembling hand to his brow in a clumsy salute, his heart pounding with newfound respect. Others followed, a slow wave of recognition spreading through the crowd. A man removed his baseball cap, a woman wiped a tear, and whispers of gratitude passed between strangers. It wasn't planned, it was raw and real. They hadn't just seen a jet maneuver, they had witnessed a tribute, paid in the silent language of a wingtip in a roar, to a man who had never sought recognition, but was finally seen. By nightfall, the moment had gone viral. A 20-second video, recorded by the teenage boy, showed the F-22's low pass and Harold standing still, flag in hand. It spread across veteran forums, then national news. Hashtags like #WingDip and #Honor Salute trended worldwide. Comments poured in. "I watched this with tears. My dad was a phantom crew chief in Vietnam." "Thank you, Mr. Benton. This man deserves every salute we've got." That pilot knew what he was doing. That was honor. By week's end, Harold's mailbox overflowed with letters and cards, some addressed simply to the Phantom Pilot, Texas, USA. Children sent crayon drawings of jets and flags. One letter from a soldier's widow broke through Harold's stoic resolve. "He always said you were the reason he came home. Thank you." Alone in his living room, Harold read it, his hands trembling as the weight of his past lifted just a little. under the world's long overdue gratitude. Harold Benton handled each letter with a reverence that bordered on sacred, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper as if they held more than just ink. He read them slowly, sometimes twice, letting the words settle into the quiet corners of his mind. The letters, carefully stored in a worn shoebox beneath the table where his radio tools lay scattered, were more than correspondence. They were fragments of lives he'd touched without ever meaning to. Each one carried a weight, a story, a connection to a past he'd long tried to tuck away. The table itself, cluttered with drawers and old transistors, stood in the corner of his garage, a sanctuary of solitude where the hum of cicadas filtered through the open window. Then one day an envelope arrived, different from the rest. It was heavier, embossed with the proud seal of the United States Air Force, and it carried an invitation that stirred something deep within him. They wanted him to speak at the Officer Training School graduation at Randolph Air Force Base, to stand before hundreds of young cadets and offer a few words. Just a few minutes, they said, just a few thoughts. At first, Harold balked at the idea. Public speaking wasn't his world. The thought of standing in a room full of crisp uniforms, their eyes fixed on him, made his chest tighten. He hadn't worn his own uniform in years, not since the days when the sky was both his battlefield and his refuge. He wasn't sure he could summon the words or the presence to fill that stage. But then, from her spot in the corner of the living room, Daisy, his old hound, lifted her head. Her eyes, calm and knowing, met his. And in that quiet exchange, Harold felt a nudge, not from her, but from something deeper, a pull toward a duty he hadn't chosen but couldn't refuse. So he dusted off his old suit, the one he'd last worn at his wife's funeral, its fabric heavy with memory. He polished his cap until it gleamed faintly in the morning light. He folded a fresh American flag with the precision of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. And when the day came, he stood on that stage before over 800 soon-to-be officers, their faces a sea of anticipation and youth. He didn't speak of glory or valor, though he could have. He didn't recount the thrill of air maneuvers or the rush of adrenaline that once coursed through him as he piloted his F-4 Phantom II through skies thick with danger. Instead, Harold spoke of Hawkeye Jim, the friend who'd flown beside him in Vietnam, the man whose voice crackled through the radio with a steady, "Go, I've got you," before his plane vanished into a storm of enemy fire. Harold's voice, low and steady, carried the weight of that loss, the quiet courage of a man who'd given everything without fanfare. He spoke of the ones who never came home, the names etched not on medals but in the hearts of those who'd flown with them. Courage, he told the cadets, wasn't always a shout or a charge. It was the whisper of sacrifice, the choice to act when no one was watching. When he stepped back from the podium, the silence in the room was profound, broken only by the soft rustle of tissues and the shuffle of boots as the entire audience rose to their feet. The ovation lasted 5 minutes, not for the words he'd spoken, but for the man who'd lived them, a man who'd never sought the spotlight but stood in it now, raw and unassuming. Harold returned to his quiet home on the outskirts of Carville, where the land stretched out in gentle waves toward distant hills. The evenings were still filled with the hum of cicadas, the creak of the porch swing, and Daisy, now slower with age, curling up at his feet each afternoon. But something had shifted. The silence that had once cloaked Harold like a shield, protecting him from the world's noise, was no longer absolute. It was broken, gently but persistently, by knocks at his front door. The first came a week after the air show, a young cadet, barely 20, standing nervously on the steps. He clutched a folded piece of paper and a pie from the town bakery, his words stumbling as he thanked Harold for his service and asked if he could just sit for a while. Harold, never one for many words, poured 2 cups of coffee, and they sat on the porch watching the sky shift from blue to a golden glow. It became a ritual. Each month, a new face appeared, sometimes a lone cadet, sometimes a pair of young officers. They didn't come with cameras or reporters. They came to listen, to sit with a man who'd seen war's fire and lived through its ashes, not just in battle, but in the long, quiet years that followed. They came to understand what it meant to carry memories without letting them consume you, to live with dignity when the world no longer asked for your service. Harold never told the same story twice. He didn't need to. The cadets seemed to understand that the lessons weren't always in the words he spoke, but in the spaces between them. The way he paused to let a memory settle, the way his eyes drifted to the horizon as if searching for something he'd left behind in the sky. One morning he found a gift on the porch railing, placed carefully beside his coffee mug, a model F4 Phantom II, hand-painted with meticulous care, right down to the black tail stripes that had once marked his own plane. A note was tucked beneath it, simple but piercing. "Thank you for clearing my skies. Latin Vasquez, USAF." Harold ran his fingers along the smooth metal wings, their cool surface grounding him as he looked up at the sky, clear and blue as polished glass. He didn't speak. There was no need. The years slipped by quietly. Daisy passed, buried beneath the old pecan tree in the backyard, her absence a soft ache in Harold's days. The visits to the porch grew less frequent, the cadets' faces blurring into the rhythm of time. But the letters kept coming. Notes from pilots, from the sons of mechanics, from the granddaughters of men he'd flown with. Some were brief, just a thank you. Others sought advice, their words filled with the weight of new wings and new wars. One cadet, a young woman, sent him her silver wings after her graduation, her note trembling with gratitude. "I wouldn't have earned these without you, sir." Harold held those wings in his hands, their sharp edges pressing into his palms, and for a moment he was back in the cockpit, the sky stretching out before him, endless and unforgiving. He placed them carefully in the shoebox, alongside the letters, and returned to his quiet life, the hum of cicadas filling the evening air. Every year, on the same day, Harold Benton made the familiar drive to Randolph Air Force Base, Section 12. He parked his old pickup truck in the same spot, adjusted his worn cap, the one with the faded emblem that spoke of battles long past, and settled onto the same stool at the small, unassuming bar just beyond the base's gates. The American flag, tattered at the edges but still proud, hung on the wall behind him, a quiet sentinel mirroring his own steadfast presence. He wasn't here for fanfare or recognition. Harold never sought those things. Yet, as the years passed, something shifted. The people around him began to notice, not with loud cheers or flashing lights, but with subtle, meaningful gestures. A passing officer might offer a respectful nod, their eyes lingering just long enough to convey understanding. A young pilot, barely old enough to shave, would pause mid-stride and snap a crisp salute, their hand trembling slightly with the weight of reverence. Very frisking. Sometimes Harold would find a folded flag leaning against the chain-link fence outside, his name scrawled in careful handwriting on a simple tag. No note, no explanation. Just his name, as if it said everything that needed saying. Harold never responded to the letters that piled up in his mailbox, the ones sent by strangers who'd heard his story. But he read every single word, his calloused fingers tracing the ink as if he could feel the gratitude woven into each sentence. Those letters spoke of a moment that had rippled far beyond what he'd ever imagined. A moment when a jet's wing dipped low over the base, a silent salute from the sky that had caught the attention of everyone below. That gesture wasn't meant for headlines. It was for him, a quiet acknowledgement of a life spent serving, sacrificing, and standing firm when the world seemed to crumble around him. Harold didn't see himself as a hero. He was just a man who'd done his duty, who'd carried the weight of war in his heart, in the memories of fallen friends in his dreams. Yet that single tilt of a wing had changed something deep within him. It told him he was seen, that his life mattered, that someone out there looked at him and understood. Sitting on that stool, nursing a lukewarm coffee, Harold's thoughts often drifted to the past. He remembered the roar of engines, the camaraderie of his squadron, the nights when fear gnawed at his insides, but he stood tall anyway. He thought of the friends who never made it home, their laughter still echoing in his quieter moments. Each nod from a stranger, each salute from a pilot, stirred those memories, bringing a bittersweet ache to his chest. It wasn't pride he felt, not exactly. It was something softer, more fragile, the realization that his life, with all its scars and silences, hadn't been forgotten. In a world that rushed forward, where stories of sacrifice were drowned out by the noise of fleeting trends and shallow distractions, those small gestures anchored him. They reminded him that honor wasn't about medals or parades. It was about the quiet moments when someone looked you in the eye and said, without words, I see you. The young pilot who'd saluted him that morning lingered in Harold's mind. The kid couldn't have been more than 22, his uniform crisp and his eyes bright with ambition. But there was something else in that salute, a flicker of awe maybe, or gratitude. Harold wondered what the boy saw when he looked at him. An old man in a faded cap, a relic of a war no one talked about anymore? Or did he see the weight of the years, the nights spent under fire, the mornings when Harold had woken up wondering why he'd been spared? Harold didn't ask. He never did. But as he sipped his coffee, he hoped the pilot would carry that moment with him, a reminder that the sky wasn't just for flying, it was for honoring too. Across the bar, a woman watched Harold from the corner of her eye. She was a regular, like him, though they'd never spoken more than a few words. She knew his story, though. Everyone around the base did. She'd been there the day the jet dipped its wing, had felt the hush fall over the crowd as they realized who it was for. That moment had stayed with her, a quiet spark that made her see the world differently. She thought of her own father, a man who'd served in a different war, who wore his own faded cap and rarely spoke of the things he'd seen. She wondered if he too longed to be seen, to know that his sacrifices hadn't vanished into the ether. As she watched Harold, she felt a pang of guilt for all the times she'd rushed past her dad, too busy to ask about the stories behind his silence. Maybe, she thought, it was time to change that. Outside, the base buzzed with life. Jets screamed into the sky, their pilots focused on the mission ahead. But every now and then, one of them would glance down at Section 12, at the unassuming bar with the flag on the wall. They'd heard of Harold Benton, the man who'd served without asking for glory, who'd inspired a gesture that had become legend among the ranks. For those pilots, the wingdip wasn't just a story, it was a call to remember. To remember the men and women who'd paved the way, who'd carried the weight of freedom on their shoulders and asked for nothing in return. It was a reminder that honor didn't shout. It whispered in the tilt of a wing, in the nod of a stranger, in the flag left quietly on a fence. Harold's heart, weathered but still beating strong, swelled with a quiet gratitude he'd never voice. He didn't need the world to know his name. He didn't need statues or speeches. What he needed, what he'd always needed, was to know that someone, somewhere, saw him. Not the myth, not the story, but the man. Flawed, tired, but unbroken. And as he sat there, surrounded by the hum of the bass and the weight of his memories, he felt it. He was seen. Not just by the officers or the pilots or the strangers who left flags, but by something bigger. A legacy of quiet heroes stretching back through time, who'd held the line and asked for nothing but to be remembered. This wasn't just Harold's story. It was the story of countless others, the veterans who walked among us, their caps faded, their voices soft, their histories tucked away in the lines of their faces. It was the story of the neighbor who mowed your lawn but never mentioned the medals in his attic, the grandfather who told bad jokes but never spoke of the beaches he'd stormed, the woman at the grocery store who wore a pin on her jacket, a quiet tribute to a war she'd survived. These were the silent heroes, the ones who didn't ask for applause but deserved it all the same. And it was a story about the power of a single moment, a nod, a salute, a wingdip, to shift how we see the people around us, to remind us to pause, to look deeper, to recognize that the quietest souls often carry the loudest stories. In a world that raced forward, that forgot too easily, those gestures were a lifeline. They tethered us to the past, to the sacrifices that shaped us, to the truth that honor wasn't about being the loudest in the room, it was about being the one who stayed. And for Harold Benton sat there, his cap low and his heart full, he knew he'd found it. He was seen. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.